Insurance companies stopped selling life policies to asbestos workers before doctors could explain why the men were dying. Frederick Hoffman, the statistician at Prudential, wrote in 1918 that American and Canadian insurers commonly declined applicants from the asbestos trades because of the assumed injurious conditions of the industry. The actuaries had noticed the pattern in their mortality tables years before medicine had a word for it. That is the shape of this entire story, the evidence arriving early and traveling slowly and being met at each stage by people who understood exactly what it meant. The word came in 1927. A British pathologist named W. E. Cook examined the lungs of a textile worker, Nellie Kershaw, who had spent her working life spinning asbestos fiber and died at 33. And in the British Medical Journal, he gave the scarring a name, asbestosis. 3 years later, the British government published the Meriwether and Price Report, a survey of workers across British asbestos plants that confirmed the disease was not a curiosity confined to one dead woman in Rochdale, but a predictable consequence of breathing the dust. Britain responded in 1931 with the asbestos industry regulations, ventilation requirements, dust suppression, medical examinations. American manufacturers read all of it. They subscribed to the journals. They corresponded with British firms. There was never a moment when the American asbestos industry did not know what the British had found. What happened next was not ignorance. It was a series of decisions, made in writing, by men who left the letters in a filing cabinet where they would sit for 40 years. In 1933, 11 men with asbestosis sued Johns-Manville, and the company settled every one of them on a condition that had nothing to do with money. The suits had been brought by a New Jersey attorney named Samuel Greenstone. Company files record the terms. Manville would pay, and Greenstone would agree not to participate in bringing further actions against the company. The 11 claimants were compensated. The lawyer who knew how to find claimants was removed from circulation. This is worth sitting with because it establishes the method. The problem was never the individual sick man. The problem was the accumulation of sick men into a pattern that a court or a newspaper or a regulator might see. Settle the 11 and the 11 go away. Retire the attorney and the 12th never files. 2 years later, the same logic reached into the scientific literature. Dr. Anthony J. Lanza, assistant medical director at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, had conducted a study of asbestos workers slated for publication in Public Health Reports, a federal outlet, the kind of publication that shapes how physicians and regulators understand a hazard. Before it went to press, Johns-Manville's attorney Vandiver wrote to Lanza asking for changes to the manuscript. The version that reached print softened its characterization of asbestosis relative to silicosis, the better-known dust disease that already carried legal and regulatory weight. A study of a hazard had been shown to the party responsible for the hazard and had come back different. In September 1935, the editor of a trade magazine put the arrangement in writing, and that letter would one day be read aloud in a courtroom. Anne Rossiter edited Asbestos, the industry's own trade journal. She wrote to Sumner Simpson, president of Raybestos-Manhattan, noting that he and Vandiver had asked the magazine to publish nothing on asbestosis, and that the magazine had always done as they wished. Simpson forwarded the letter to Brown. Brown replied that the interests of the industry were best served by asbestosis receiving the minimum of publicity. That phrase, the minimum of publicity, is the closest thing this story has to a confession, and it is worth noticing how ordinary it is. There is no conspiracy language in it, no secrecy oath, no coded reference. It is a lawyer answering a routine question about press relations in the tone a lawyer would use about anything else. The men writing these letters did not appear to think they were doing something that required concealment. They filed the correspondence in the ordinary course of business, indexed and retained, the way a company keeps records it expects will never be turned against it. In 1936, 9 asbestos companies agreed to fund scientific research on their own product, and the agreement specified who would decide what the science said. The work went to the Saranac Laboratory in upstate New York, under Dr. Leroy Gardner, one of the most respected industrial hygiene researchers in the country. Brown's correspondence establishes the terms plainly. The manufacturers would control what was published, and manuscripts would be submitted to the sponsors for approval before release. Gardner did the work. Over the following years, his animal experiments produced something the sponsors had not asked for and did not want: tumors in mice exposed to asbestos. Not scarring, not asbestosis, cancer. Gardner reported the finding to the men paying for the laboratory. Under the terms of the arrangement, that is where it stopped. The medical literature of the 1940s, the literature a physician in a mill town would have consulted when a 50-year-old insulator arrived coughing, contained no such result. The finding existed. It was simply held in private hands, by agreement, and the agreement had been signed a decade earlier by people who anticipated exactly this situation. Leroy Gardner died in 1946, and 5 years later his research reached print with the cancer findings taken out. The work was edited and published in 1951 under Arthur Vorwald. The mouse tumors did not appear. In the same period, Johns-Manville's medical director wrote the document that would define the story. Dr. Kenneth Wallace Smith set out in a 1949 memorandum the company practice regarding men whose chest films showed asbestosis but who were not yet disabled. They were not to be told. The reasoning was recorded. The man could continue working. The company would keep the benefit of his experience. A diagnosis, in this framework, was not information belonging to a patient. It was a personnel consideration. Smith's own account of what came next appears in deposition testimony he gave in 1976, near the end of his life. He said he had urged the company to place caution labels on asbestos products around 1952, and that management declined. Johns-Manville did not put warning labels on its products until 1964, 12 years after its own medical director says he asked, 37 years after Cook named the disease. There is a second piece of testimony that belongs beside this one, and it must be kept separate from Smith's memorandum because it comes from a different man in a different decade. In a 1984 deposition, attorney Charles Romer of Union Asbestos and Rubber Company recounted asking Vandiver Brown whether Manville would really let its diagnosed men work until they dropped dead. Romer quoted Brown's answer that the company saved money that way. One is a written policy, the other is a lawyer's recollection, decades later, of a conversation. They point the same direction. They are not the same evidence, and the distinction is the reason the record held up. In 1964, a New York doctor with no ties to the industry published a study that the industry could not edit. Irving Selikoff, working with pathologist Jacob Churg and statistician E. Kyler Hammond, examined insulation workers, not factory hands in dust-choked mills, but tradesmen who cut and fitted asbestos products on job sites, and published the results in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Asbestos exposure caused lung cancer. It caused mesothelioma, a cancer of the lining of the chest and abdomen so specific to asbestos that its presence is nearly a diagnosis of exposure, and it did so in ordinary trade work. The scope of the problem changed overnight. It was no longer a few thousand mill workers. It was every pipefitter, boilermaker, shipyard laborer, and construction insulator who had handled the material. Hundreds of thousands of men, most of whom had never worked for an asbestos company in their lives and had never been warned by one. Clarence Burrell was one of them, a Texas insulator who sued in 1969. In 1973, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that manufacturers were liable for failing to warn users of a known hazard. That ruling opened a door. Thousands of claims followed, but the plaintiffs still had to prove what the companies knew and when they knew it, and that proof was still sitting in a filing cabinet in New Jersey. In 1977, a New Jersey attorney named Carl Ash walked out of Raybestos-Manhattan's records with hundreds of pages of correspondence that had been sitting undisturbed for 4 decades. They were the letters between Sumner Simpson and Vandiver Brown, the Rossiter letter, the exchanges about the trade journal, the arrangements around the Saranac research, 40 years of ordinary business correspondence between two executives, showing what the companies knew, when they learned it, and what they decided to do about it. The material reached Ronald Motley, a trial lawyer with Blatt and Fales in South Carolina, and was introduced in litigation in Barnwell County. The trial judge, reading the correspondence, characterized it as a conscious effort by the industry in the 1930s to minimize the hazards of asbestos dust. Everything changed with that finding. Asbestos litigation up to that point had been a grinding, mostly losing effort. Sick men against corporate defendants arguing about what was reasonably knowable in 1940. The papers ended that argument. The companies had documented their own knowledge and their own choices, in their own words, and filed it. On August 26, 1982, Johns-Manville filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy while it was still a profitable Fortune 500 company. It was not insolvent. It cited projected personal injury liability from claims not yet filed by men not yet sick, and used the bankruptcy code to convert an open-ended tort exposure into a bounded one. The Manville Personal Injury Settlement Trust began paying claimants in 1988 and quickly reduced payments to a fraction of assessed value. A man who proved his case might receive cents on the dollar. Dozens of other firms followed the same path. A 2005 analysis by the Rand Institute counted roughly 730,000 claimants and about $70 billion spent on the litigation through 2002, involving more than 8,000 defendant companies, the largest mass tort in American legal history. Because mesothelioma can take 30 to 40 years to appear after exposure, men were still receiving diagnoses in the 2000s from work done in the 1960s, and epidemiological projections published in the intervening decades anticipated tens of thousands of additional deaths still to come. What the Simpson papers finally established was not a conspiracy in the usual sense. There was no secret meeting, no cabal. There were memos. There were polite letters between executives who liked each other, discussing publication strategy and press relations and personnel policy, using the vocabulary of routine management to make decisions that determined how long men would breathe. Vandiver Brown was not hiding when he wrote about the minimum of publicity. He was working. The letters sat in that file room for 40 years. During those 40 years, the men who installed asbestos in ships and schools and office towers went to work without warnings, and their doctors treated their coughs without knowing what to look for, and their families washed the dust out of their clothes. The knowledge existed the entire time. It was simply filed in the wrong cabinet, and no one had thought to open it.